I'll be giving just a very brief talk about a new activity that's currently underway in the ISCT, which, similar to the ISSCR, has an interest in the promotion of the research and development into stem cells, but also into a broader range of cell-based interventions, things like immune cell interventions, or even reproductive medicine, and in some cases, gene transfer as well. So this is a presidential task force that's been set up by the current president and the president-elect. And essentially, what it's going to be doing is looking at this question, this issue that we've been talking about for much of the day, which is this problem of the, you could call it the premature or the unvalidated commercialization of cell-based interventions in general. Certainly, though, with a focus on stem cells, because that seems to be the primary area of market growth right now. But as it is the ISCT, and so it's not limited to stem cells, we also have, of course, an interest in other types of cell marketing. So things like progenitor cells, various types of immune cell treatments for cancers. And there's also a very age-old market for what are called fresh cells or live cells or Sika cells, which come from the freeze-dried cell extracts from fetal animals like rabbits or sheep, which are actually making a comeback these days based on, marketing messages that associate them with the stem cell efficacy. And this is something that we're seeing around the world. So whether it is stem cells or progenitor cells or these fresh cells, the marketing claims tend to be unsupported by the quality of scientific evidence that you would typically see in getting a market authorization from a regulatory body. So if you look at the websites, and there are indeed hundreds, as we've heard in the morning's talks, they target well over 100 diseases. I saw one website that had 180 diseases listed. One of those diseases was disease not listed, which meant that essentially everything else fell into that. But as you can see here, a number of these, in addition to the medical claims, there are of course aesthetic claims, which was alluded to in some of the morning's talks, anti-aging claims. There are also other product categories which are not really a priority for us, but I think it should be mentioned that they're out there. Things like stem cell cosmetics, which were mentioned in the morning, stem cell nutraceuticals. So these are the idea that not that they contain stem cells, but that they boost or enhance stem cell activity in the body if you drink them or swallow them. There are even there's a whole separate industry of veterinary treatments making claims using stem cells usually for horses and dogs. But really, clearly our first and highest priority is looking at these medical claims targeting, in many cases, very serious diseases. And one of the things that is also of concern in this issue is that there is an increasingly sophisticated and organized and activist industry which is involved in providing these types of interventions and which is now undertaking to challenge some of the established regulatory frameworks. So the task force itself, it was just convened earlier in late summer of this year. It's got currently 20 members. It's been growing, actually. It started with about 15 members, representing 10 countries. It's led by I mentioned the current president, Kurt Gunther, and the president-elect, Massimo Dominici. It has representatives from academic science, from medicine, from industry, so companies that are actually engaged in cell therapy R&D. People who study policy and law and ethics as well. And as I mentioned, it's going to look at cell therapeutic products in general. So the goals that were handed to us at the outset of this project were to review the major scientific and ethical issues involved in this kind of this business activity, to work with various other committees within the ISCT, and they have a number of committees dedicated to specific types of cells and to things like gene transfer. And to review, for one, the state of the science, specifically with regard to the different types of cells that are out there being marketed and to the different indications for which they're being marketed. Additionally, a major component of what we're doing is to develop effective communication strategies. a few years ago, in 2010, the Society had already published a white paper on this issue of what they called at the time stem cell tourism. And so now there's going to be a follow-up, a much more detailed white paper published in the Society's journal. They will hopefully, as part of the project, this is still in development, is develop tools to aid in patient decision-making and also to serve as public advocates for the field and contribute to the Society's own communications through social media and the Society newsletter, et cetera. And then a third, and the area that I'd really like to talk about more in detail today in subsequent slides, is the idea that hopefully we'd like to work together with other interested parties in this sector, be they academic or research societies, or more broadly scientific or medical organizations, perhaps regulators, perhaps patient organizations or disease advocacy groups, to address the issues more comprehensively and effectively, and also in a way that helps to dilute the impact of these kind of tu quoque arguments that say, well, everyone has their own kind of conflicts, and so therefore, we're all free to pursue various agendas. I think what we're trying to do here is to show that the weight of the reputable scientific consensus is certainly on the side that most of these things are not ready for marketing or commercialization. So we're now just starting to work as separate working groups. So those 20 people that are in the task force have now been allocated into one or more of these groups. So one of the important groups is actually definitions. And so, for example, the old term stem cell tourism really has fallen out of favor by people who look at this area because, well, A, it doesn't necessarily involve stem cells. Even things that are advertised as stem cells actually in many cases turn out not to be such. And tourism itself, for one, has problems because it has these kind of casual connotations and also identifies the patient behavior. But what we really are looking at is the behavior of the supply side, of the providers. Additionally, we're seeing more and more growth domestically here in the US and in other highly developed and regulated countries. So tourism is no longer necessary for patients to avail themselves of these interventions. Obviously, scientific evidence and biological rationale is self-explanatory. Issues in cell processing with respect to whether the Society is going to develop any kind of further guidance in addition to what's already been out there in terms of what should be in place for a legitimate either research and development or even a marketed stage intervention. Issues in clinical practice, of course, this touches on things like medical practice and where the limits of medical practice or where medical practice ends and the marketing of a product begins and whether that is different in different contexts, which also touches on the regulatory aspects. Commercial implications, obviously, because there are economic implications of changes in regulation as well. This is something that group will be looking at. Communications, I mentioned already. ISCT policy is going to look at whether the ISCT, for example, should develop policies about what to do about, for example, if they find that members are engaged in these kind of business activities, whether they should take action or embrace them as part of the community with a differing perspective on the issues. And so that's the kind of questions that are being looked at. Once the drafts from the various working groups have been written, then the idea at present, and this is still, as I mentioned, a work in development, the idea is to perhaps bring in more liaisons representing communities such as the regulatory community, the bioethics community, and perhaps patient or disease advocacy groups. And again, this is just to ensure that we get as broad as possible representation and participation in this activity. So some of the key issues, I mentioned the first one already, developing an appropriate terminology. So even just describing the phenomenon is difficult to find an adequate descriptor that is accurate and specific enough to define the phenomenon. One of the ideas that's been put out there is to describe the phenomenon itself is the direct-to-consumer marketing of cell or cell-based interventions, but it's really a mouthful and it doesn't have that kind of appeal that the simple term of stem cell tourism has enjoyed, both within the research community but also within the broader the public and the media. So that's still something that we're still trying to wrestle with. One of the big questions, and I think this is something that regulators around the world are also asking themselves, is what are the levels of scientific evidence that are needed to justify routine use or commercialization? So entry into the standard of care is something that the people in that working group are going to be looking at, and whether there is a continuum rather than a kind of a binary state of enough or not enough. George mentioned this already, so this is something that we're also looking at with this idea about medical innovation or surgical innovation, and what are the limits to that? What is the role for that within the research and development spectrum, and what are the limits to that model? Part of just the basic background research is to look at the rapidly evolving global regulatory landscape. It's really amazing how many different countries are now struggling to develop their own regulations, or the ones that have developed regulations, the ones that are in some cases now looking to modify or amend their regulations, and to find places where there are gaps and possibly contradictions within the regulatory landscapes. The ethics, of course, is something that will get argued about even after we finish this project, and so that's kind of a never-ending story, but clearly there are ethical issues in the direct-to-consumer marketing of products or procedures, whatever you want to call them, that really haven't passed through a regulatory pathway or haven't established that level of scientific evidence that you would expect of a marketed product. Implications for industry. So, for example, if this pathway towards deregulation continues to go on unchecked, I think it's going to have implications for some of our industry members who are committed to developing cell therapy products within the traditional context of a three-phase clinical trial, which of course is costly and time-consuming and risky. And so if their direct competitors are able to get onto the market, for example, without having to do R&D, it's going to be very serious implications for the current incentive structure that drives research into efficacy and not just safety alone. Developing effective communication strategies is something that's gotten talked a lot about today. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll breeze through these last 2 points. And importantly, we are looking to reach out to other organizations and to work on an equal partners basis. Certainly it's something that the ISCT is not seeking to be a leader in, and certainly we recognize, and I should mention that I was indeed part of the ISSCR working group that developed their own the closer look at stem cells and their own communications directed at patients. So the ICT does recognize that other work has been done by various groups, some with a specific focus on one disease or one group of diseases, and some with more of a focus on stem cells in general. And we hope to be able to reach out to these types of groups and work together so that we can develop a message that really carries the weight of a broad sector of the scientific and medical communities, as well as hopefully incorporates the voices of patients, saying that they themselves are interested in having treatments that not only have been shown to be safe, but efficacious as well. So this is our call for collaboration. These are all the types of groups that we're hoping to work with, hopefully in the near future. And of course, that will be up to the leaders of the, I'm not the leader of this task force. I've just been asked to tell people about what's been going on within the task force. And so hopefully, if you are contacted by the ISCT, it would be something that if you are concerned about this phenomenon, that it will be something that you or your organization would be happy to sign on to. This is just the original white paper that was published back in 2010. And as its title shows, they said it was a time for action then. I think it's a time for action now. Thanks for your attention.
And our last speaker for this panel will be Glenn Shatman from the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology.